I'm looking now largely at the history of Ireland itself, and we go back about 8,000 BC. The first people arrived in Scotland. In fact, our connection with Scotland is so deep that, as I say, we're largely the same people, but in the recent vote for independence, there was some interesting conversation here. Next up from that, again, if you ever are coming to Ireland, I strongly suggest you go to a place called the Cage of Fields, which is in North Mayo, and it is an archaeological site where they have uncovered a field system, which is 5,500 years old, and it is recognized as the oldest known field system in the world. I'm taken aback by that myself. It is, and that is directly north of where all my ancestors come from. So my ancestors may have worked in those fields for all I know. Newgrange was built in 3200 BC. Talked about that earlier. Now, the question of the Celts is a thorny topic. They arrived sometime around 2000. We do not know, did the Celts arrive in large numbers? Did they kill the existing inhabitants? That's probably not the case. Did they arrive in small numbers and bring their language and culture with them? So, for example, we speak, the Irish language is a Celtic language. It is related, as I showed in the diagram, to many other Celtic languages in Europe. But the fact that we speak it does not mean that there were large numbers of so-called Celts here. I speak English today, but there were very small, in number terms, very small numbers of English in Ireland. So maybe we were colonized in a slightly different way. In any event, we eventually became known as Celtic, but I would warn anybody, if you hear the term Celtic, be a large grain of salt, because Celtic is a complex term which, really probably doesn't mean anything. It was something the Romans came up with. But in any event, their language and their art and their culture certainly came here. Things like the Druids. We had lots of gods. We had gods in the trees. We had gods in the stones. We practiced human sacrifice. I believe we even practiced headhunting here. We went naked into battle like a lot of the Celtic cultures. But we need to be very careful with the view that is held, not just of the Irish and the Scots of the time. This was a Roman view of the world. We were regarded as uncivilized, and that's the theme that will carry on, not just for the Irish, but for many other peoples. When the Europeans arrived in North America, they considered the Native Americans savages. So the idea that some group of people were savage and primitive and dangerous and fearsome goes back a long way. So that was us. That was the Irish and the Scots, and the Welsh to a certain extent. Now, Christianity arrived in 400 AD, roughly. St. Patrick is seen as our national saint, but in fact St. Patrick was coming to minister to existing Christian communities at the time. So the Christian communities were here, and that influence of Christianity had come through from Roman Britain. As you'll see over time, Christianity developed slightly differently here. A lot of Christian practice in Ireland, once you dig a little bit, things like holy wells, they go back to pre-Christian times. Our holy mountains like Croagh Patrick in the west of Ireland, it was a pre-Christian place of worship. So Christianity was grafted on, as it was in many places, onto the existing Irish culture. So the next diagram here we look at in the post-period. It's important to understand that in the period, the early Christian period up to 1200, Ireland became, in what they call the barbarian years. I know that the so-called dark ages in Europe are not as dark as people make them out, and that there was a lot of learning and culture in Europe. But the influx of the northern tribes, the Germanic tribes in Europe, had put a stop to a lot of the development, let's say, of a lot of what the Romans had established. But in Ireland it continued, and we were known as the Islands of Saints and Scholars, our monasteries, things like the Book of Kells. And in fact, from the Anglo-Saxon period, it was the Irish that re-Christianized England from the north. Now, there was a re-Christianization from the south as well, from Rome, and there was actually a big clash of the Christian cultures, which is something, if you want to read more about, is a very interesting, because the Irish Church at that time, which seems like a strange thing to say now, looking at modern history, at that time we were not connected to Rome. Irish Christianity was non-Roman, and it was going its own way. So in any event, I have a marker there on the year 1169. This is when the Normans arrived. There was a dispute between two kings in Ireland, One of the kings here looked for help from England. Normans, as they were wont to do, saw a chance for some gain in Ireland. And Henry II of England realised that if the Normans came on their own, he might lose control of the kingdom in Ireland. So he established and declared himself King of Ireland, largely without the approval of the local people. And it was approved by the Pope at that time, who happened, coincidentally, to be an English Pope. So we suddenly were now part of England. But largely the Irish kingdoms and chiefdoms continued intact. There was little change to that. The Normans who came here merged with the Irish and became the Norman Irish. And in fact, they ended up being, as the phrase goes, more Irish than the Irish themselves. Families like the Fitzgeralds, they were Normans. They were Feast from the French, Gerald, the son of Gerald. They mixed here. Where my ancestors are from, down in the west of Ireland, there's a family name down there which is very common, which is Jordan. And this name comes from a family of Normans which came at this time. They were called the De Angelos, and they settled in that part of Ireland. Their castle is still there. Well, it's a ruin of a castle, like most castles in Ireland. And the De Angelos, one of the sons or grandsons of the family, well, his first name was Jordan, so he was Jordan De Angelo. His children became Mac Jordan, and then the Mac was dropped, Mac being son of Jordan. The Mac was dropped, and the family name Jordan exists to this today. So you don't have to dig too far to find the Normans in Ireland. So I merged with the Irish, and at this time there was, in the 1336, there was something called the Statutes of Kilkenny. This is interesting for modern times as well. The English Crown issued laws which were to stop the English and the Normans who were living in Ireland from becoming Irish. They were not allowed to wear Irish clothes. They weren't allowed to speak the Irish language. They weren't allowed to take an Irish wife. They weren't allowed to live like an Irish person. There were strange things, like they weren't allowed to ride a horse the way the Irish rode horses. Whatever that was, I don't understand it myself. So there was an attempt to separate the colonizers from the locals. It didn't work. The English and Normans in Ireland at that time did mix with the Irish, and as I say, became more Irish, and even began to speak the language and dropped the English and Norse French or Norman French. At this time, the English power, royal power, was confined to what they call the Pale. And for those of you interested in linguistic phrases, when people talk about outside the Pale, as in other words, something which is not acceptable, in other words, which is beyond the boundary of civilization, they're talking about this period in Ireland when the Pale, the area around Dublin, was fortified to protect them from the, in quotes, savage Irish.